This is the Humans of Gaming podcast, an open and honest conversation about games, life, and belief.
Hello and welcome to Humans of Gaming. I'm Drew Dixon. I am the Chief Content Nerd at Love Thy Nerd and one of the hosts of this podcast. And I'm joined by Chris Gwaltney, my co-host. Hey, Chris.
Hey, what's up? I'm Chris. I'm the Chief Executive Nerd for Love Thy Nerd. And yeah, welcome to Humans of Gaming. We love to find developers and people working in the games industry and get to know them a little better as people. Not just talk about the things that they make, but talk about who they are and what makes them tick. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, but also we do talk about the things they make, just not only the things they make, because the things they make are pretty cool. And that is definitely the case with our special guest today, which is Rob Daviau. Hey, Rob, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
How did I do on your last name?
You did it great. We didn't go over it before we started recording, so I was wondering, like, how's he going to do?
That's true, man. He just dives in.
Yeah. How often do people get it right?
If they don't know me at all, 5% of the time.
Is that French?
It is French.
Name?
If you picture an X on the end, it also just reaches peak French.
Yeah.
But I tell people the AU at the end is like potatoes au gratin, right? It's that steak au poivre.
Fancy.
Nice.
You can tell I cook a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Are you into cooking?
It's my main hobby.
Oh, cool. Do you get into like any of the cooking shows?
I do. We just finished this season of the Great British Baking Show.
Oh, Rob, yes.
And Top Chef is starting soon. I'll occasionally watch some Chopped. That's about it. I've tried other ones over the years. Actually, there was one on Netflix which had really high-end chefs from around the world, like international ones. I can't remember the name. That was a pretty interesting one.
Great British Baking Show is my jam. That's the one that's kind of like stuck with me.
That show is on repeat in our household.
Yeah, the aesthetics of that show are fantastic.
Yeah, my wife said the other day, she's like, anyone who skips the opening to this doesn't understand the show.
I agree. It's lovely. It really is.
I think what we love about that show is it's just nice. I feel like so many competition shows are like just cutthroat and mean. But like on this one, like people are like helping each other and they're like crying when people are leaving. And it's just like so nice and refreshing.
And even the judging, which can feel kind of brutal, is like, it's just honest. It's not mean spirited. It's just,
Yeah, there's some joking to it. Like you can tell that they feel bad when the person doesn't get it, like they're honest. And I tweeted out a couple weeks ago, I said, future historians, that this is as good as we got in our civilization.
They're the
Study
best.
Study this, right? This was us at our peak. But it's just refreshing that like everyone's trying to do well and everyone's trying to win, but it's not that American style of TV with gossip and nastiness and who's the villain in this, reality show. And it was just, that's what I like about it.
They are the best of us.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have like, what is your jam in terms of cooking? Like, what do you love to cook?
I say that I cook things I haven't cooked before, right? That I'm always like looking for different areas to cook in. That's not entirely true, which is I tend to cook Northern Italian, like New American.
Yeah.
I like Southwest sort of flavors. I live in New England, so I am a product of my time. So I just, it's fall out, so I made acorn squash, bisque with bacon and chorizo toppings and stuff like that.
Sounds amazing.
I just got back from a week in Spain visiting my daughter who's studying abroad there.
Oh, nice.
And so we took a cooking class. She had part of the orientation for her college had done a cooking class. And so she contacted the guy. So my daughter, my wife, and I went, we just cooked in his home. I mean, that's his job, is teaching in his home. So it's a very nice home. So I was kind of studying the Catalan cuisine and what they do. And oddly enough, my favorite thing I tasted there is this, they serve with every meal, or just about, is just tomato bread. And you're like, what? And it's like lightly toasted bread with, you just take a fresh tomato and rub it on it so the juices soak into the bread. And then
that's my kind of cooking.
Olive oil and salt on top. And instead of like bread and butter or rolls with something, like sort of, it's just, I took a bite and I was like, well, that's nice. And then by the third day, I'm like, I need the tomato bread. It's just it's so comforting.
Yeah. That sounds awesome. That's cool. Well, don't want to forget to like frame who you are for our listeners.
Oh, I'm Rob.
Hey,
yeah.
Rob.
So, I would say in terms of like people we've had on this podcast, I think you're by far the most prolific board game designer, I would guess. Trying to remember who all we've had on. We've had some great board game designers, but you've made a lot of board games. How would you frame like your work in the games industry to our listeners?
It's actually, this week is my 21st anniversary of being a game designer. So I was at Hasbro from right around Veterans Day in 1998 until 2012. And then I've been on my own now for a little over 7 years. I tend to make games that reflect back to what I loved as a kid, which was role-playing games. I played a lot more role-playing games as a kid and even young adult than board games. And there's a long story I've told elsewhere, but I sort of I got very lucky about getting a job at Hasbro. And I certainly love board games, but I love games that tell a story and make you feel like you went on a little adventure. So as my career has gone on, I've leaned more and more into games that like have a strong narrative element. Not that I haven't done I've done kids games. I've done a lot of Risk games. I've done Trivial Pursuit, licensed games. Like, it was really nice to be at Hasbro and get sort of like a steady paycheck to learn how to do this job. And how to make games for people who weren't me. Like, make a game for 6-year-olds. Okay. Yeah. And it took me a while. So when I left, I had a pretty good idea, I thought, of how to make games. And then I had to relearn it all over again of how to make games when no one else is around me telling me, don't do that.
Yeah. And I think like just for our listeners who are into games, like I guarantee you've played a game that if you're listening to this, I'm guarantee you've played a game that Rob's had his hands on. I mean, you co-designed Risk Legacy and Pandemic Legacy. I think I've heard people say you're kind of one of the first people to make a legacy game. Is that right?
Yeah, I came up with the idea.
So, I mean, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Depending on your perspective, thanks or how dare you.
Yeah. Like I said, it's basically just a role-playing game in a box, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I do. Like, you have perpetual character sheets and you say, okay, let's pick up last week we were here, and you move on from there. Yeah, no, I also was, I did some design development work on the original Betrayal at House on the Hill back like 20 years ago or 18 years ago. I mean, the idea came in and it was like brilliant. And then I knew what Hasbro was going to make. It was too complex for the Avalon Hill market when I was with Hasbro. So I spent a lot of time, like a year and a half, like sort of reworking it into the shape it is now. But yeah, mostly known for legacy games.
So, I mean, and when you got started, right, you were doing stuff like Trivial Pursuit and
Clue, Trivial Pursuit.
What else?
Done some Monopoly games, a lot of Star Wars games. I did Star Wars Epic Duels.
Yeah.
Or co-design. I've done a lot of co-designs. I like talking and working with people. Back in 2002, and then my company, Restoration Games, we just rebooted it as Unmatched. It's like just coming into market now. I was the editor-in-chief on Trivial Pursuit for much of last decade. And then I did a number of DVD games, which was kind of like app games before there were apps.
Yeah. So like Seen It type stuff?
Yeah, Seen It came out. So we did some Trivial Pursuit with DVDs. And then I did a Clue DVD and a Monopoly DVD called Monopoly Tropical Tycoon, which I'm still very proud of, especially given the limitations of DVD technology.
Yeah.
Because the DVD doesn't know what's going on the board and vice versa.
Right, yeah.
So it was fun to try to get those things to feel like they were part of the same ecosystem.
Yeah, that's cool. So you said you kind of lucked into working for Hasbro. How did that happen? And maybe before you answer that, were you like gamer nerd growing up and stuff? Were you always into this kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my mom was a big board game player when I was a kid, sort of the traditional board games, like the mass market games, but I played a lot of them. And then I got to be 10 or 11 and I had kind of outgrown them, but then I went off to summer camp and discovered comic books and Dungeons and Dragons and sort of fell in love with adventure, right? So I'm reading X-Men and I'm playing first edition D&D and this was in 1981. Played that pretty regularly through 85. And then I was starting high school and driving and getting a girlfriend. And I was like, I'm too cool for this now. I kept the comic books, but no one wanted to get together all day and play D&D anymore because people had jobs and other things going on. So I sort of backgrounded it, but it never quite went away. And then in college, a good friend of mine from high school, we lived together one summer. We were both working in the same restaurant. We wrote this epic D&D adventure, which took us years. We started that summer, and I still want to get it published. It was really cool. And so then I played that, and I was in various role-playing groups throughout the 90s and making my own homebrew systems. But I was in advertising as a job, as a writer, and I realized I got an article published in Dragon magazine in 1998. And I'm like, man, this is more satisfying than than selling forklift brochures. And so I said, I'm going to work in advertising 4 days a week and spend Friday writing role-playing stuff where I won't make enough money, but it'll be fun.
Yeah.
And so I started looking for freelance opportunities, happened to look in the paper, saw that Parker Brothers, which is owned by Hasbro, was looking for copywriters. And I'm like, all right, I'll throw my hat in the ring there. I'm a copywriter. It'd be good to have them as a client.
Was that your, did you study journalism writing in college? Did you?
No.
Okay.
I've always just been a guy who has a lot of ideas and I can't draw. So I've kind of learned how to write.
Nice. Okay. Cool.
I have a degree in classical civilizations, a minor in medieval history, and I left college a semester early to go intern with David Letterman because I was going to be a television writer.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And then I worked in television. Well, this sucks. And
oh, really? What did you not? Because I think for a lot of people, that'd be like their dream job to work in television. What did you not like about that?
I don't like New York, and I like LA even less. It's very...
Amen.
It's very cutthroat. I like visiting New York. I don't like living there. It was a little overwhelming. Television's very cutthroat. And this was before there was a gig economy, because now when I say this, it's like, this just sounds pretty normal. But I didn't like the idea of getting it through, like a 13-week contract here and then going and pitching a game over there and getting some money from a pilot and then punching up a script and sort of constantly having to hustle for your next job. Now I'm like, that's what I do all day long. But at age 22, back in the early 90s, I'm like, I think I just want something where I go to work.
Sure.
And I was like, I don't want to be in New York. I don't want to be in LA. And I really loved comedy, and it was making me not like it. Like when your hobby becomes your job, your perception changes. I was like, this isn't what I thought it was. And there are times I look back, because like I was born like the same week as Tina Fey. And I was in a sketch comedy group in college, and I arranged an invitational, and a different group came over from BC. And I realized just earlier this year that Amy Poehler was part of that group. And so some of that generation of comedians, I was working in the same area or the same age. And sometimes I see them and I go, what if?
It could have been me.
Could have been me. And I'm like, I don't know if I would have liked it, but that's one of the few things about the road not taken that will get me like once or twice a year.
Yeah. I don't know how it couldn't. I mean,
chances are I would have failed, right? So I don't really know, but when you don't take that path, you were a wild success if you had taken it.
Yeah. So you wrote some like material and stuff for Letterman?
No, I was an intern, so I photocopied the scripts and answered the phones. Hello, late night, right? And lied to people.
You're really good at that. Wow.
Yeah, I'd put them on hold and be like, so and so, and they're like, no, and I'm like, I'm sorry, he's in a meeting right now. Can I take a message for you? Like, just lie to talent people trying to get their client on the show. But I did sort of get a front row seat to seeing how it was done and reading the scripts and watching filming. And once or twice I would pop off to a different floor and watch the rehearsals for Saturday Night Live, because it was in 30 Rock, just Studio 8H versus 6A. And everyone in there seemed tired and miserable.
Yeah.
But I wrote like a spec script for The Simpsons that never got picked up. And I was in conversations with an agent at William Morris Agency to represent me. And then I'm like, nope, I'm out of here. Thanks.
Yeah. And so that was Hasbro was the ticket out of that or?
No, there was a gap. That was in 92.
Okay.
And then I worked as a prep cook and just sort of kicked around and then got moved to Philly, got an advertising job, moved to Boston, got less satisfying advertising jobs. And then that turned into game design in 1998.
Yeah. That's cool. So what were your first work in game design? What was the first thing Hasbro had you working on?
So I walked in and it was the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, just to give some perspective. And there had been a game in the 80s called Scruples. It was a lot of really awkward questions that would ruin dinner parties.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, we're going to reboot it because it's timely, right? Because of the impeachment of Bill Clinton and that scandal. And I know it's kind of hard to believe now, but Hasbro had just put out Monopoly Star Wars the year before, and they're like, we think branded Monopolies are the future. And so they said, you have Monopoly Looney Tunes and a reboot of Scruples. That was my first day. And Star Wars Episode 1 was on the horizon. There was a different group working on it, but they said, they knew I was a writer. Like, we might have you do Trivial Pursuit based on that.
So your first day in the office, you're like looking up facts about Looney Tunes so you can figure out what the different spaces on the board are going to be. And
yeah, I'm trying to think because there was internet, but it was pre-Google.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I
can't even imagine that.
I was trying to think, like, how did I actually figure? I said, okay, I made a Word document. Okay, houses and hotels become this. Here are all the spaces. What do they get renamed? What is money? What is the community chest cards and the chance cards?
Yeah.
And I created that document. And when I left in 2012, that document was still being used by people for their like branded Monopoly. It was just 2 columns. Here's the standard number 9 is what they call it, because it's literally serial number 9. And then here's the branded version to the right. And so I created that document. I came up with the idea that the properties were different cells of animation. And once you got a monopoly of cells, you could put it on TV. Then once you got 4 TVs, you could put it in a movie theater. So
I'm curious because, I mean, I think given the type of games you work on now and the things that you've done in the industry, was that like, did you enjoy that or was it soul crushing?
Oh, I loved
Monopoly.
It.
Okay.
I remember that first year thinking if I won the lottery, I'd come to work the next day.
Yeah.
That's a good place to be.
That was a very good place to be. My first wife, I now have a second wife. My first wife was pregnant with our first child at the time. Like, I was going to be a dad. I was a board game designer. I worked at Parker Brothers. I was working on Monopoly. I was going to get to work on Star Wars games.
Yeah.
Like, I had lived the dream.
That's cool. That's great.
Yeah, what happened was there was a Hasbro relocation about a year and a half later where they moved from the Parker Brothers office to the Milton Bradley office on the other side of Massachusetts, about 2 hours away from each other. Hasbro had acquired both. And I moved into the Milton Bradley office. And I don't know if it just the honeymoon period wore off because it was going to wear off, but it was this real physical change. Like, it was attached to a factory. The building wasn't as nice. The corporate culture was different. Pretty much from day one, which was a year and a half into my career. When I got to Milton Bradley office, I was like, oh, this is a job, right? I worked in the basement for 11 years with no windows. There'd be whole days I didn't see the sun. And
yeah, that'll affect you.
And it was very interesting because the factory was attached and we shared like the cafeteria. And then there was like office workers and factory workers. And you could really see the sort of class difference, like between people who do shift work and people who are salaried. And they were trying to not treat the two groups differently, but there was always a little resentment because salaried people, you'd get yelled at if you were back to your desk 5 minutes late because people have to be on the line for the line to run. So the shift workers couldn't be late. So, and we're like, well, but I worked late last night and they get overtime and we don't. And it was very interesting. I got sort of a front row seat to some real class issues.
Yeah. Yeah. So you eventually kind of broke off and now you design games independently, correct?
Yeah.
What was that?
Basically what happened was 11 years later, Hasbro moved again. This time they consolidated into the corporate office in Rhode Island. I had since gotten remarried. I shared custody of my kids with my ex-wife, who was local, and she wasn't moving, and I didn't feel like not seeing my kids. And realistically, it was time to go. It had been years where I was like, okay, I want to do my own thing, but it was a steady job with 401k matching and health benefits, and I was up to 4 weeks vacation.
All that stuff.
I was like, I can't, in good faith, with these young kids and child support payments, everything, just be like, I'm going to go do freelance and hope it works out.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
So I tried to commute to Rhode Island or get an apartment down there, and after a year, I was like, no, this isn't working. It's time to go on my own. And that was in 2012.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I think, like, I don't know, we live in this culture now where I think everybody wants to claim that they're doing exactly what they want and what they love, and they don't care about things like 401ks and blah, blah, blah. I think that's like our current like cultural attitude, and the younger generation maybe. But those things, like, they matter on, so they, I mean, when you have a family, like, you have to think about those things, and you have to think about making sure you're around and you can be supportive. And
sort of the nature of being a parent is it's not about you.
Yep.
Right. And so I couldn't in good faith just say, I'm going to quit and maybe scrape by for a year or two, when I had probably around 2009 or 8 was when I would want to go. I had a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old in child support payments and a mortgage. And I'm like, well, that's just irresponsible.
Yeah.
Right. So then you try to work and like, how can I make this job better? And it was, I don't want to say I was trapped, because that's overselling it, but I realized just the parameters were, there was no other place I could take my skills without physically moving. There were precious few of those. Mattel was in Los Angeles. Spin Master was in Los Angeles, like a big company that could pay for stuff. Wizards of the Coast, as a branch of Hasbro, was in Seattle. And I'm like, well, my family's not going to relocate, so how do I make it work here? And, I would have years where it wasn't so bad, and then years where I was thinking, I'm not really working on what I like, but it's not that hard at this point. I could make kids games. So I would just learn to cook or, be a dad. But it came to a head in 2012 because I couldn't keep the job. And so I was forced to leave the nest. And it was touch and go for a couple of years in terms of, my wife also left Hasbro. That's where we met. And she got a sort of steady paying job. And that got us through that transitional period it took about 3 years. It really took until Pandemic Legacy hit for me to feel like, oh, okay, I got a little cushion, my company.
Yeah. So I assume you made some games before that didn't quite take off the way that you'd hoped, or maybe that you needed them to, in terms of providing a steady income and that kind of thing.
It just, yes, there was like 1 or 2. Mostly the first year after I left Hasbro, I left on good terms. I just consulted back to them. So I was just getting paid to consult. And I was working on Seafall and a couple other games. And then I started Pandemic Legacy in 2013, but it took 2 years before I got a paycheck. So when I start a project, it's about 2 years before I see any money. So it just took a while to fill that pipeline. And what I saw by 2014 was my consulting work was taking a nosedive, and I could either spend a lot of time getting more consulting work or just bite the bullet and try to fill the pipeline for 2016, 17, 18, which I did. It just takes a while before those go in, and not every game succeeds. Like Seafall came out big. I made it a decent amount of money, but then people didn't like it that much. The reviews went down, and it just, was one and done. And then there's other games, like I have Mountains of Madness with Yellow, which doesn't get a lot of buzz or attention, but twice a year I'm like, oh, it's a decent
Dude,
enough.
what a hilarious game. That game, like, I just love watching people play that game. I think maybe more than playing it myself is just watching other people, because just the information you don't know and how ridiculous it is.
Yeah, I'm really happy with that one. And that, that's like a quiet kind of seller. And I've reached the point now, let's see, I get paid 4 times a year, and usually around now. So I have my chart up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 11 games that generate some income. The lowest one was $53. That was Seafall last quarter.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're not putting all your eggs in that basket anymore. So
No,
but you don't have to. So
yeah, and that's the thing is, as long as you keep putting new games out, as other ones tail off, you can replace them. And if you put 3 or 4 out, maybe one will do well, and 2 or 3 will do okay, and one will bomb. But I've really been fortunate enough to be able to pay my bills, and then this past 2 years be like, oh, I can put a little aside. Like I can't retire, but if I have a bad year, I can get by.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite got to the place, and I don't think I ever will, where I just have a Ticket to Ride or a Pandemic or a Cards Against Humanity, like this mega brand that just comes out, gets big, stays big, spawns a bunch of things that play off it, and then you're in a position where you go, oh, I can predict my income for the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
That's harder and harder. It's harder to do in general, and it's harder every year, and you can't count on, I'm just going to go to the plate and hit a grand slam 3 times in a row, right? Like I'm going to buy the right lottery ticket. So I always count on a lot of games that do very nicely.
Yeah. Well, if you do happen to come up with an exploding kittens like idea, let us know. Yeah. We will we'll invest in that.
Yeah, you never quite know.
Yeah, that's true. So before I kind of want to get turn gears a little bit, or change directions a little bit, and ask you some about growing up and what that was like for you and stuff like that. But before I do, is there like a game that you've made that you're most proud of? What's in your repertoire that you've made that you look back on and go like, yes, I love that game?
Well, the only game that I've had, not the only game, one of the few games, the go-to game that I've worked on in some way that I will play, because usually you get to the end and you're like, oof, I don't want to see you for a while. I'll watch other people play it. Is I still really like Betrayal. I'm particularly proud of the work that myself and a lot of other co-designers and developers did on Betrayal Legacy, which came out just about a year ago.
Yeah.
I felt like it did a good job marrying the Legacy idea and the Betrayal idea. And I mean, 2 completely unstable systems that had to work together.
Yeah, that's no small feat.
Yeah, there's this recency bias, right? When you say, what am I most proud of? I'll just name things from the past year because they just came out and I'm like, oh, sure, that's good, right? So it's hard to go back and say, Monopoly Tropical Tycoon DVD was a good game because it really did some fun stuff with Monopoly and a DVD because it was 2006. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I looked at it now, if I would still feel the same, but I think I did a good job there. I don't know if it's weird. It's mostly, I mostly just stay very much in the present or 2 years out.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while I'll be at some event about to give a talk and people will say like, our next designer, did this and this and this and this and has done this. And I was like, oh, that sounds pretty cool when you say it that way. Like, but I don't really think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're in Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you grow up in that area or where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Maine. So I've sort of always been a Northeast person. I've lived Maine, Massachusetts, New York City, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But
what
I've
part
been
of Maine?
in this, it's a town called Waterville. It's in central Maine, which is not the center of Maine. It's the center of the populated part of Maine. So still relatively far south.
Yeah.
It was a town with 18,000 people. It has Colby College is there. There's a smaller community college. At the time, it had some factory work. Paper mills were still there, and there was a shirt making factory. And it really was the end of the 50s quintessential American, working college town with a lot of jobs. And then as I was leaving, and in the past 2 or 3 decades, it's the factories have gone away.
Went to hell.
Yeah, to the point where, the downtown Walmart came in on the edges and killed the downtown. Like it was just, they went right down the checklist of what happened in America. So it's a little like sad to go there. I still get nostalgic, but I'm like, oh man, this is where I used to buy my D&D books, and now it's just an abandoned store. But Colby College kind of realized that people weren't going to go to school there if the town was this shell. So 5 years ago, or maybe, they made a real investment in the downtown. They actually built like a student living down there and some offices and are forcing students to live on camp, like in the downtown with a shuttle, which caused stores to open up around it, which caused restaurants to open up around it, which has caused some revitalization.
That's good.
In the town.
Yeah. What did your folks do growing up?
My dad was sort of a small town lawyer, so a little bit of everything. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom until I was about in high school. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. So when my youngest brother got to be a little self-sufficient around like 9, she went off and she was the English department secretary at Colby College, which she had that job for like 20 years maybe.
Were you guys religious at all? Did you go to church or anything?
My mother was and is quite religious, Roman Catholic.
Okay.
My dad never quite as much. I can't recall him coming to church with us. Yeah. But I went to Mass pretty faithfully as a kid. And sometimes we would sort of, I don't want to call it cheated. It was really interesting. There was a hospital right across my backyard. Like I could walk there. And if we were really busy, we would go to the little chapel at the hospital where the doctors and nurses would go. Because 1, it was closer, and 2, they were all busy. So it was like a 30-minute speed mass. And that was my mom's version of, we're going to church, but we don't quite have enough time to drive downtown and park and go in.
That's awesome.
You probably appreciated that as a kid.
I did. I mean, it's funny. I remember the coolest part about church is when they would have a reading from the book of Luke, because I was 7 and Star Wars had just come out.
Oh, nice.
You're like, oh, Luke, I know that one.
Yeah.
No, it's funny. I remember as a kid going to church and I just like hated it because I would just have to sit there. And like now, a lot of churches are different. Like they have all these fun things for kids in the morning. But back then it was just like, nope, sit through the service, and I would
stand up when they say stand up and sit down when they say sit down.
Yeah, I do. I remember when I was in high school, so I had all the natural rebellion and snark of a teenage person. I got into theater a little bit, and my one day that I didn't have rehearsal was Sunday. My mom's like, we're going to church. I said, I don't want to. I go to play practice the other 6 days a week. She was like, what is that supposed to mean? I'm like, you stand up, you sit down, you say your lines, you hit your marks, and you go home, right? Like, it's just the same thing. And she was not happy with that.
Yeah, I bet she took that really well.
Yeah, attitude, yeah.
Do you remember, like, were you into it, or at any point would you have called yourself like a Christian, or was it always kind of like, this is just a thing that we do and I don't really know what I think about it?
More the latter. Like when I was a kid, I'd say my prayers before I went to bed at night, but it was a little bit out of, fear of dying, at age 6 when you went to sleep. It was not from a position of love. It was from a position of slight, like, oh, you're supposed to do this because someone's watching, an invisible parent. Got my first communion. I was 7, don't remember that, but I do remember by the time I was going for my confirmation, I had a lot of doubts, and I was trying to convince my mother that I don't really want to be a confirmed Catholic because I'm not buying what they're selling right now. I have questions.
How old at that point?
14, 15. And I remember her saying, just become a confirmed Catholic and then you can make your own decision. And I was like,
like that scene on Nacho Libre when he baptizes his partner when he's not looking, he's not ready.
Right.
Yeah. And I was like, well, that's kind of the point. I'm not confirming, but it was important to her. And her mother, my grandmother, was alive at the time. And so I did it, but I remember thinking, oh man, like, all the like classes you went to lead up to it and obligations. I was like, I'm not feeling this. I have more questions than they're giving answers for me. And,
do you remember any of those like questions or the core doubts?
Well, I'm trying to think of whether I remember. I remember wanting to approach Christianity intellectually. I was always like a analytical sort of person and a student who would like probe and ask questions. So I remember they had someone local come in who wanted to basically, it was a little fire and brimstone. Like he was a guest talker, and he basically said, I remember he said, if you don't marry a Catholic virgin as a Catholic virgin, you're going to hell and there's nothing you can do about it.
Okay. That's a hot take.
And I went, why?
Yeah.
I didn't say it, but I'm like,
Yeah.
really? Because there's plenty of other Christian faiths, and I have friends with them who basically follow the same New Testament book and aren't like Jews, the children of the book as well, and this builds upon. And they were like hearing none of it, and I was trying to like expand it and say, well, what if you just lead a good life? Right? How can there be all of these religions? Aren't they all manifestations of the idea of ethics? Right? There's a pretty good sense if you look at laws and codes across the history of things that are allowed and not allowed. And there's obviously things that are different in these different cultures, but we've sort of agreed that these are good. Like, isn't all that matters that your works and deeds, not the dogma surrounding it? And these were the sort of questions I was having. And when I tried to ask them, and certainly not as succinct as I just said there, because I was 14,
right?
I got a lot of just read the book and show up.
Right.
And that sort of drove me away from the sense of
almost like, hey kid, we just want to get you through this thing.
Just get through this thing. And then as I got older and I studied, medieval history and early Christianity through stuff, and I was like, wow, the Catholic Church has not always been lawful good, so to speak, right? Like, there's a lot of things where you look at it and go, well, why did they do that? And you look at the Crusades and you looked at forced conversions and proselytizings and the Spanish Inquisition. And you go, how can this idea of Jesus's teaching of turn the other cheek and we're all brothers turn into, zealous crusades to, burn it all down. God will know his own right at some point. Yeah. And so I found that I become, pretty much, I don't want to say an atheist. Well, I guess agnostic as I got older. Like I have no problem with people finding faith however they want to find it, that guides their own conduct or holds back the forever fear of death that we all have. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons to do it. And I'm like, that's great. That's your choice. I've made my choice. I might find religion tomorrow. I might see a burning bush and have a different opinion. But right now I just try to lead my life by the code of what I think is right. And hopefully if there is a God, he or she or it is like, all right, you didn't follow this dogma, but you followed the intent of it. And then it would all be okay.
Gotcha. So and this is like kind of a heavy question, but you brought it up and I'm always curious. So you talked about how a lot of, people of faith, it helps them with that fear of death. Is there something that like helps you with that fear of death that we all face?
Just the natural evolution of my brain I just read this last week that most people's brains are wired to think that death is an unfortunate accident that happens to other people. But I'm turning 50 in the spring. So I keep probing at that big fear. I start to, right? I have a friend who's done a lot of palliative care. And I said, well, when people know they're dying, do they get this peace as opposed to terror? And he said, dying doesn't make you a philosopher. And I was like, he's like, you got to do the work early and think about it so that, when that time gets closer, if you're conscious of it, if your brain's still working, right? You've done the pre-work to be ready to be done. But it's a hard thing to approach because to
force yourself to think about because it's so unpleasant in a lot of ways.
Right. And if I really had deep faith that I'd led a good life and therefore when I died, I had an afterlife to go to, that would make me feel so much better. Yeah. Right. You're like, oh, I'm leveling up and going to the next thing. And, and I'd be like ready to go. But in my mind, it's going to be like, just like it was before I was born. Like, I don't know, I go to sleep. Right. And the circuit shut down. And then who knows what happens? Do I become part of the cosmos? Is spirit and mind just a series of electronic impulses in our head? And there's no answers. And you only learn when you die. So no one can give us the answers in my mind, by my faith. So I'm like, well, I'll just try to do good stuff while I'm here. And then try to think about as the end gets closer, making peace with that as much as possible.
It'd be interesting to talk to your friend who does palliative care about how you do that, that prep work. in the meantime. So I'm not quite as old as you, but I think I've hit middle age now, and I'm curious of how you prep for that.
I don't know. He actually, he and his wife just went through a divorce very amicably or something, and then he went up to. It was like almost like he checked all the stereotype boxes. He went to Tibet on a mission with people to deliver medicine, like at 18,000 feet. And now to sort of like clear his head, he is in a New Mexican monastery with no electronics or communication out for like the next 3 months.
Man, he is in it.
He is in it. He is one of the most introspective, meditative, spends a lot of time thinking about it. But he's even conscious of the fact that if you spend too much time being meditative and thinking about it, you actually just disconnect from everything. Like you go so far within that you miss the point. So I think this is just his transition from a end of a marriage to the beginning of what's next. He's taking 3 or 4 months to do some deeper resets.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. You just have to go to Tibet and then to New Mexico, and you'll be good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just make 2 trips, and you've got to figure it out. No, that's interesting. So you said how old are your kids now?
20 and 16.
Okay. So you've just about finished the whole. I say finished. Like
I have finished what I call active parenting.
Yeah,
right.
Finish the first leg.
You're finished the part, and now it becomes mentoring, right? In a way, and how do you transition to a relationship with your kids when they've if you've done what you need to do, they go off as adults and don't need you on a regular basis because they're fully formed adults who don't know everything because they have to learn them and hopefully use you as a source of comfort and knowledge.
Which is probably like both affirming in a way. Like if your kids don't need you anymore, it's affirming in a way that's like, oh, I must have probably done okay here. But then at the same time, it's probably...
Oh, rips your heart out. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. To say, I did this job well is to rip your own heart out and say, because I am not needed anymore on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That I am a source of comfort, either checking in and texting or quick Skype calls or something because she doesn't live near me, or being a harbor for holidays and birthdays and special places. But that doesn't feel good.
You're right. Yeah.
It's like, don't you want to kind of flame out of college and live at home for 6 months? Like,
isn't that funny how like so many parents, dream about getting their kids out of the house and having more freedom and blah, blah, blah. But then like they leave and you're like, don't you want to come back home?
Yeah. I had a different experience because my, I got a divorce when my kids were 6 and 2. So I've been a part-time parent most of their life.
Yeah.
So I have periods where like I'm a parent for 4 or 5 days and then I'm basically just not a parent for 4 or 5 days. So that desire for them to
be around is even greater for you.
It was greater at the time, and the transition when they left is not as abrupt. I'm not saying, please get out of the house so I can finally, stop paying for babysitters and my grocery bill. It's like, no, they're half the time here, half the time not. Now my son, who's 16, he's going to get his license in like 2 weeks. He's going to be haunting the house half the time. Right? He's just going to be out and about.
What is he into? Is he are your kids gamers and nerds like you?
My daughter. We
say nerd as a term of affection, by the way.
Oh,
so when I say that, it's like,
I couldn't stop being a nerd, so I went pro.
Yeah.
My daughter's a little bit more of a nerd.
Yeah.
She's in theater, more of a theater nerd with a little bit of gaming. My son is actually genuinely cool from how he dresses, and he writes and records his own music.
Dang.
Nice.
Puts himself together. So he plays video games more.
Yeah.
I can't think of the last time I played a board game with him.
Yeah.
Also, and this comes as a surprise to people, often the last thing I want to do at night is play a board game. Because I've been from 7 a.m. till 5 or 6 at night. I've been thinking about them and working them. And then when I do play in the night, it's often play testing what I did. So if I get a free night
like
where
more work.
Yeah, it's like I want to cook or I want to watch TV.
Yeah.
And I used to play video games a little bit to feel like I could entertain myself in a different genre, but I sit down now in the controllers. I'm like, I don't have the Twitch memory. Like I haven't played enough to know the controllers instinctively. So if I really want to game and get away, I go back to my role-playing roots because it doesn't feel like my job. This isn't to say I don't play board games. I just a lot less than people who don't do it for a living.
Right. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's fair. Like even with what we do for Love Thy Nerd, I felt that to some degree in the last year, especially. Like I recently got into mountain biking, so it's kind of like a new hobby of mine, and so that's made it to where I have less time to play video games and board games. Things. I still have a board game group every other week, but like part of it, I think for me is that I needed something outside of gaming and nerd culture because so much of what we do here is like it does feel like work sometimes. Like it feels like I have to keep up with this stuff to keep the website going, et cetera, you know, so I get it.
Well, I'm currently finishing up a presentation I'm giving next week at Tabletop Network, which is right before BGG Con.
Yeah.
It's a work. Basically, it's a 2-day course on how to be a game designer. And the talk I'm giving is how to be a professional game designer. Like, I'm not going to talk about how to make a game. I'm going to talk about how to make it your job.
Yeah.
And I start out right at the beginning saying, when you make something a job, the job part follows.
Yeah.
Right. And now it may be a satisfying job, but it's a job. And so you have to decide whether you want to do that.
Yeah.
And then when you do, you have to be prepared for your relationship with your passion to change because of money, because of obligations. And you need to find a new hobby that you do with your downtime that isn't the thing that you're working in. Not that you won't continue to do it, but you need something else that is money and obligation free.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
good. That's a good word.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to find that these days in our kind of like gig economy where people are working so many different jobs and like also their side hustles are all like wrapped up in things they're passionate about. So I think sometimes like culturally we struggle with like making time for something that's just going to be enjoyable and I'm not going to get any kind of paycheck, or it's not a stepping stone towards a paycheck. It's just something I'm going to do to enjoy my friends and family or to enjoy myself. I think we need that.
You definitely need it. I, at some point, said something like, what was it? When humans have downtime, they either make something or engage in some sort of storytelling. And as far as I can tell, everything falls into those two categories. Yeah. Even if it's just sitting around a table and talking with your family, that's storytelling, or often playing a game, or I'm going to go to the woodworking shop and, make a new hammer handle, right? That you're either creating something or telling stories or be involved with it. And that's pretty much everything that comes down to free time.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
You have a meeting to get to and we got started a little bit late. So I want to let you go and get to what you need to do. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to follow what you're up to?
The best place is Twitter. It's at Rob Daviau, which I'll spell ROBDAVIAU. I try not to post a lot. Try to do quality over quantity. And often it's more cooking.
That's cool.
And occasionally some mildly left-wing politics.
Okay.
I live in Massachusetts. I'm very frustrated with the state of health insurance in this country, being a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah.
So
well,
I sometimes lash out there.
Well, there's everyone's disclaimer before you decide to follow Rob.
Yeah, I just like if people sign up and they're like, "Oh, hold on,
what's this healthcare stuff?"
Yeah, what's this healthcare stuff? What's this?
I don't live in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So
I thought he was just going to talk about Pandemic Legacy.
I will. I talk about games, cooking, general parenting, and then occasionally like, why are there tariffs coming out on board games out of nowhere? Right, like that.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of ranting. I try to minimize it, though.
That's all right.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. I will say Pandemic Legacy is some of the most fun I've ever had around a table with friends. So definitely, like if you're listening to this and you haven't played any of Rob's games, go play them. Go check out Risk Legacy or Pandemic Legacy. if you've played a little bit of Pandemic before, which I assume a lot of our listeners have, you'll pick it right up and you'll love it. And you'll have lots of memorable moments around the table. So
yeah, and Pandemic Legacy, Matt and I are done with season 3. It's a trilogy.
It is on the horizon.
Oh, man.
It's on the horizon. It won't be out this year because it's already the middle of November. But stay tuned. So if you haven't played them, you have a little bit of time to catch up on seasons 1 and 2 before the third one. And if you have played them, it's coming soon-ish.
Great. Yeah. Well, we're excited.
Just add the ish on there.
Actually, I don't have a date, but I'm like, I would be surprised if it's not next year sometime.
Yeah.
But I don't know when.
Yeah, very cool.
Great.
Well, definitely go check out Rob on Twitter and check out his games. And then check out what we're doing with Love Thy Nerd at lovethynerd.com. You can see lots of great articles, podcasts. We have a podcast network. We have a comic book podcast called The Pull List. We have Free Play, which gets into all areas of nerd culture, and a lot of gaming talk on that show, and it's great. Yeah, I think that's about it. If you're interested in supporting what we do, go to lovethynerd.com/give. Is that right?
Partner.
Chris? Partner. There we go. lovethynerd.com/partner. I should know that. Yeah, because we need help. We need your help to do things like this. So if you really think what we do is great, go check that out. And you could help support this podcast and our website and all the things that we're trying to do across the country. So, yeah, thanks, Rob. This is great.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.